So Canada and other countries similar, but Canada is a good example, did not have a financial crisis like the United States had in 2007, 8, 9. Canada, had a slowing of economic activity, but primarily because of the U.S. Canadian banks stayed healthy. There wasn't huge bankruptcies in Canada. Home prices in Canada never shot up, and they never really declined. And yet, at the same time, the questioner argues, Canadian banks are far more regulated than American banks. So is this a case where more regulation is good? And maybe if America regulated its banks like Canada's banks, we wouldn't have had a financial crisis. Now, that's a very, very simplistic view, and one that ignores cause and effect. It's taking one attribute and assigning causality to it, which has nothing to do with the actual cause of the crisis. Canada had a lot of things that the United States did a lot of things right that the United States did wrong. For example, Canada has no Freddie and Fannie, so no massive subsidies towards housing. Canada doesn't have a tax deductibility of your mortgage. So they are less incentivized Canadians to own versus to rent. The whole area of housing policy, which the United States has, does not exist, at least not to the extent that it exists in the United States, in Canada. So Canada has much closer, if you will, to a free market in housing than does the United States. The United States is much more involved in regulating housing. Second, I argue that one of the major causes of the financial crisis was Federal Reserve behavior, the fact that the Federal Reserve kept interest rates below the rate of inflation for 2.5 years. To its credit, the Canadian Central Bank didn't do that. So it never created the bubble. The bubble that those very low interest rates created in the United States was not created in Canada. And as a consequence of that, plus the fact that Canada didn't have housing policy, they never got a housing bubble like we did in the United States. So they had saner government policy, which resulted in them not having a deep financial crisis. Now let's go to banks. I'm not convinced that Canadian banks are more regulated. Maybe in certain areas they're more regulated. I would argue that in other areas they're less regulated. And suddenly, historically, Canada has less regulated financial institutions than the United States. And I'll give you one example, which is historically very significant, maybe less significant today, but historically quite significant. The United States used to have regulations that used to say that you could not branch across state lines. So every bank had to be within the state. And there were very few exceptions where banks were allowed to be national banks, to diversify geographically. In Canada, I think there are 5 banks, basically. I mean, there might be a few small ones, but they're basically 5. In the United States today, there are 7,000 banks. Now, we're not that much bigger than Canada. But even worse, 30 years ago, we had 21,000 financial institutions that are like banks, S&Ls, and so on. Canada had 5. So Canadian banks have always been healthier. They've been better diversified. They've had different sources of income, both geographically. They've also been universal banks in the sense that they never had Glass-Steagall. They've always been allowed to do a variety of different things. Canada also came to the central banking world later than the United States. They've had a central bank for fewer years than the United States has had. So on a number of levels, I would argue that the Canadian banking system has been healthier historically, has been less risky than the American banking system. And we saw that again in this crisis. But it's not because they're so regulated. It's because in key aspects, key features, they are indeed less regulated than American banks. America is still, the banking system over the last 100 years has been one of the most, if not the most, regulated industries in the U.S. And actually, the regulations of banks go back to the founding of America. It's one of the first industries to be regulated in America. In those days, it was regulated by the state. So every state had different bank regulations, but all banks all states heavily regulated their banks. Canada was freer in terms of the banking sector from the beginning.